If you want to change the world, tell the world your story. If you want the world to change you, listen to another person's story. I have been telling stories ever since I could talk. I grew up in an only child household, so there were always adults around who were more than willing to listen to whatever cute and often ridiculous things I had to say. My husband, David, would argue that that still holds true to this day, and that is why I am standing on this little red dot right now. I got into storytelling through the nonprofit The Moth, if you've ever heard of that. And they hold these things called story slams, where you get on stage and you have 5 minutes to tell a story about your life based on whatever the theme of the evening is. My first story, I got on stage and I talked about how when David and I first got together, my family would often refer to him as my friend whenever we were out in public, and how that made me feel. After I left the stage, a woman came up to me and told me that hearing my story helped her understand her daughter better. But the thing is it happened again the next time I told a story. This time, I was on stage talking about mine and David's first rundown apartment together, complete with cockroaches and the toothless exhibitionist cowboy neighbor next door. Yeah, take all the time you need. And whenever I got off of the stage from that, a couple came up to me and told me that in their early 20s, they had lived at the exact same apartment complex. And so the next thing I knew, we were spending the rest of the evening swapping stories about living on Nightingale Road. And I had made another human connection. And soon I realized that I wasn't just telling stories for fun anymore. I was telling them to make those human connections, to build community, to be embedded in all these different circles in Louisville. So I was invited to tell a story at the Festival of Faiths about mine and David's long journey to being the first gay couple to get married at our church. And in that story, I talked about what it is like to be a queer person attending weddings of your friends and families in non-affirming spaces, and how there's this expectation that you're allowed to be there, but you should sit down during the slow songs, and you shouldn't, hold hands or anything, because you don't want to make anyone uncomfortable, do you? And how that is like the emotional roller coaster that queer people often go through whenever they attend weddings in these kinds of spaces. And after the show was over, a man came up to me and asked me if he could give me a hug, because in all of his years of considering himself an ally, he had never thought about that experience before. So I was blessed and highly favored, as they say. I was telling stories all over the city, making all kinds of new friends, all kinds of community connections, and then the pandemic happened. And all of those relationships that I had built, all of my friends, all of my family, complex human beings were reduced to pixels on a screen. And the thing about pixels on the screen is that they're a lot easier to argue with, to denounce, and to block than people are. And this was compounded even further by the spring of 2020. Louisville went through a long overdue racial reckoning with the murder of Breonna Taylor, and a bunch of people, myself and David included, took to the streets, and we marched in protest. Now, I have several police officers in my family, so you can imagine how contentious some of the conversations that we had on the internet were. For a brief period of time, my own mother blocked me on Facebook, but don't worry, we're fine now. Love you, Mom. Pretty soon, I find myself living online during the pandemic in a silo, an echo chamber. And the thing about those silos is that when you're in them long enough, you begin to think that your personal life experience and your lived experience is a universal experience, that everyone has the same experiences as you, that everyone thinks and comes from the same space that you come from. And so whenever you live in that silo long enough and you begin to bump up against people who have different perspectives than you, it's really easy then to label them as other, as wrong, maybe even bad. And if we're not careful, when we label people that way, we can become the very bullies that we often claim to stand against. So, how do I talk with my uncle who thinks that me being gay is living in addiction? How do I talk with my neighbor whose skin is darker than mine and for whom I often represent and sometimes unconsciously participate in their oppression? What about the ones who light menorahs or the ones that pray to Mecca 5 times a day? What about my neighbor who is literally a voodoo priestess? No, really, she's a voodoo priestess. So we're all so different. How can we even begin to think about finding common ground and common humanity? And this is not meant to be a definitive, we are the world kind of answer. But nevertheless, my answer is this. You start by telling your story. And you follow that up by listening to other people's stories. You see, there is a neuroscientist named Paul Zak from Claremont University who did a series of studies about the way the brain reacts to being told stories that follow the universal story structure that you see behind me here. You might recognize this from your 7th grade language arts class many years ago. Right? And the thing is whenever we are told stories that follow this structure, our brain produces 2 chemicals, cortisol and oxytocin. Cortisol is the danger chemical. It helps us pay attention to the stimuli that is around us to keep us safe. And oxytocin is known as the bonding chemical. It is the chemical that helps us feel connection between each other. And so when we hear stories, our brains emit oxytocin, and the more oxytocin the brain emits, the more likely we are to listen and believe and feel a connection to the person who is telling us about their lived experience. And so, in other words, whenever I was on stage talking about being a queer person in church spaces, that man who wanted to give me a hug, my story literally changed his brain on a biochemical level. This is why it's so important for us to have because the sheer swiftness with which the United States changed its stance in the early 2000s on gay rights owes everything to the brave people who came forward and shared their stories with their friends and family. And for people who didn't think that they knew any queer people, they got to see those stories played out on television, namely through the TV show Will and Grace. That show was so influential in that flip that sociologically they refer to that flip as the Will and Grace effect. So when we tell each other stories about our differences, we find our common humanity. In my spare time, I work with nonprofits, and I help them tell their stories, usually for fundraising purposes. And I'll never forget the first person that I supported to tell their story for that reason. He was the board chair of a local nonprofit that helps end cycles of poverty through homeownership. And the folks had asked him to get up in front of 150 plus people at their annual fundraising breakfast to tell his story about how he felt connected to this kind of work. He was terrified. He did not want to do this. He didn't think that anyone would care about what he had to say. And yet, with a little love and support and, maybe a little shoving, he took to the stage that morning to tell his story. And that's when he told this room of 150 or so people that he, an older black man in his late 60s, grew up as a sharecropper on a plantation in Belzoni, Mississippi, with 0 renters' rights. And his life's goal was to leave the plantation and to own his own home. And when he did that as a young man, his new goal began to be to return to that plantation and to help his brothers and his sisters and his mom and his dad to leave the plantation as well. I can still hear the tremble in his voice when he told that crowd of people that he was able to pay the down payment on his father's first home. And whenever he was finished, tears were streaming down his face, because for him, he saw the work this organization was doing as an extension of his life's mission, which was to help families leave the plantation. And when he was finished, the entire crowd erupted, and they stood up and they clapped for 3 minutes solid, and that breakfast raised 70% more money compared to the previous year. You see, not only do we see each other when we tell our stories, we often literally find ourselves when we tell our stories. When we tell each other stories, we realize just how different we all are and how beautiful that difference is, that it makes life magical. And when we tell each other stories, we realize that as different as we all are, we really aren't that different at all. And so, I close today by asking you, do you want to have an impact in your community? Do you want to change your little part of the world? Tell your story. Thank you.